Wow, what a crowd. You're a rock star, Stephen. And it's a bit like deja vu for those of you who were here yesterday when Stephen was speaking with Willie Dalrymple. Perhaps the only difference is we don't have a British Prime Minister on the front row. Though with the title Second Chances, who knows, maybe we'll get an American president on the front row before it's out. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you, Stephen. I won't repeat Willie's paean of yesterday, which we all agree with. You are a titan amongst historians and literary critics. And as for those of us who are European Renaissance groupies, and I'm sure everyone is, you are, as Shakespeare has it, of Cassio talking to Caesar, you're a colossus. Though let's not forget that Cassio finally stabs Caesar in the back, but that's not entirely irrelevant to today's subject. And as Freud would put it, you are absolutely a father figure. You spoke yesterday about The Swerve, that extraordinary text, that extraordinary book that takes us on the journey from the ancient classics of Greece and Rome through the Islamic Middle Ages more than the Western Middle Ages into the man's rediscovery through the Renaissance of all kinds of learning, which provided the context for the literature and the arts in many ways that came through the Renaissance. That is a book in one of your great areas of Renaissance context. Today we're talking about a book, your latest book, which is more about Renaissance text, because as well as being the great historian, you are the great literary analyst. And we are looking at this book, which sadly is not yet quite available in India, but when it comes, grab it, because it is one of the greatest books of deciphering and understanding Shakespeare that I've ever read, and I've read a lot of them. And that book is Second Chances, Shakespeare and Freud. Many books about Shakespeare's texts look at very specific and strong themes. Yourself, you've done power and purgatory and justice and governance and so on and so forth. This book is unique in that you have, Stephen, found a theme, if we can call it a theme, something that embraces all 38 of the plays, actually, which you call Second Chances, and you'll explain in a moment. But really, rather than a specific theme, what you are studying is something that matters to every single person in this room, which is why you should all read the book. How do you live your life? And how do you actually accept your life or not accept your life and try to change it? So this is something we all do all the time. And this you analyze through so many of the plays. So let me just say a quick thing about Freud. We're going to talk about Shakespeare, almost primarily here. So if any of you are haters of Shakespeare and are here for Freud, don't leave, because we will actually make Freud subconsciously, to use a bad pun, present in what we talk about. This book Stephen wrote with a very great psychologist and psychoanalyst specialist in the UK called Adam Phillips. But essentially, Stephen, you wrote the first half of the book and Adam wrote the second half of the book, which is on Freud. So we won't take words out of Adam's mouth, as you couldn't be with us. We'll just concentrate on Freud. But when we get to our conversation, we will try to make sure that there is a Freudian relevance to the things we talk about. And that said, Stephen, welcome again, and please tell us about our Second Chances.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you all for being here. It's always dangerous with any great complex writer like Shakespeare and others to think that you found the key to it all, the magical key that will open the mystery. And I'm not at all claiming that, but actually I'm almost claiming that. That is to say, I became quite excited rather late in life by realizing that Shakespeare was oddly obsessed with the notion of the possibility of having a second chance in life. It was a feeling that you could glimpse actually even early in his career in ways I could explain, but that becomes increasingly intense as he got older, possibly for his own biographical reasons, but also because of reasons having to do with his thinking about the nature of his medium or the theater are questions that we can come back to. In any case, many of the plays are interested in this idea that you might have a second chance. And you could think that that's obvious, and if you do, that's good to think it's obvious. The odd thing is that it's not shared in any striking way by his contemporaries. Christopher Marlowe is not particularly focused on the idea of the second chance. Ben Jonson is not focused on the idea of the second chance. And now the women writers who have been recovered in recent years and about whom you will hear at 2 o'clock if you go to my wife, Rami Targoff's session on her book, Shakespeare's Sisters, you'll find that they're not interested in the idea principally of finding a second chance in life. So that struck me as peculiar, and I started really from the far side of Shakespeare's career, thinking about why he wrote the late plays the way he did, why he wrote Winter's Tale, The Tempest, which are very explicitly and directly concerned with the notion that something has been wrecked, you've ruined something in your life, something has fallen apart, and you're dreaming about the possibility of getting something back. And Shakespeare, as the greatest playwright in the English language, and one of the deepest thinkers in the English language, about how you achieve what you want to achieve and what blocks you from achieving what you want to achieve, threw himself into this question.
So, Stephen, let's actually jump into a massive area of crossover between Shakespeare and Freud. And I'm talking about families, I'm talking specifically about parenting, and I'm talking in Shakespeare about, perhaps particularly again, mothers and sons, fathers and daughters, and to a certain extent, phrase I use, father figures. Maybe there are some mother figures, I'm not sure, but father figures, people like Falstaff and so on, are certainly there. Now, if we just tip back to when the Western world in particular became most conscious of Freud in the 1940s and so on, there's a lot of work immediately done by people like Ernst Jones and so on how Shakespeare was an extraordinary 500 years before precursor of Freud in that, most famously, I suppose, in analyses of Hamlet and Oedipus complex and so on, extraordinary sort of readings of Lady Macbeth sleepwalking when she seems to sort of emanate guilt in an almost Freudian manner, and is observed indeed by a doctor, kind of psychoanalyst, trying to say what's going on here. So, there is something of Freudian psychology deeply inside Shakespeare, it would seem. And you again raise the late plays, and of course there are 4 plays really in which the father-daughter relationship is so critical. But just how important were family relations, and particularly parental relations, throughout the corpus?
Well, it is the case overall that Shakespeare is a poet of the family. Shakespeare imagines the state in terms of family. He pictures rulers, for good reason, having to do with his writing in a monarchical system. He pictures rulers always in relation to both their parentage and also their children. But he also thinks that the crucial events, psychologically, politically, morally, ethically, can be best understood in the context of thinking about family relations. And that is true in plays from the beginning of his career to the end, including from the history plays also to the comedies and the romances and the tragedies. That said, there is something peculiar, as Paul says, about the way in which fathers and daughters figure in the later plays. And this is crude, but one might as well start there. Shakespeare had daughters. He had 2 daughters, with one of whom he got along very well, with one of whom he had an extremely problematical relationship, and basically he had, in effect, abandoned both of them when they were quite young, moving to London, running his career in London, while they remained with his wife and the son, as long as the son lived, in Stratford. And it used to be said that that's what everyone did, but actually, if you examine the last will and testament of people who were involved in the theater, and now that can be done, you find that Shakespeare was almost unique in not bringing his family with him to London when he decided to move there. He left his family behind. He didn't abandon them financially, as far as we know. He sent them money. We know that he bought a very fancy house for them and for himself in Stratford, but he didn't live with them. And when he decided to retire, which was quite young, as we were saying before, I mean, relatively young, or at least by my standards, relatively young. He was still in his 40s. He made the decision to return to the wife and to the daughters. His son was dead at that point, whom he had left behind. So I think, let's start there, that late in his life, in his literary career, Shakespeare began to think about what relations would be between fathers and daughters, and whether it would be possible for a father to find the daughter that he had lost, and whether it would be possible for the daughter to find the father whom she had lost. And that feeling, the feeling that you might reconnect after a long, terrifying period of absence, is one that haunts those remarkable late plays. It's not the only feeling. There's also a profound feeling of guilt in relation to the spouse whom you've harmed or abandoned. But the daughters keep coming up again and again in the late plays.
They do in the late plays, and of course, you know, with Marina and Perdita and Imogen and Miranda, literally the Wonder Woman, Miranda, one, you know, sees that extraordinary capacity for reconciliation and second chance. But there's perhaps an even more famous play earlier on, which is a father and three daughters and no mother. I wonder if you ever wonder why we never hear of Mrs. Lear.
I mean, Shakespeare in general, as you will probably know, tends to erase women. He doesn't erase the older men, but with some exceptions, the terrifying Volumnia in Coriolanus, a handful of more plausible older women, but in general, they're eliminated in his plays. He may not have had an actor in his company who was good at playing old women, so he may have decided for practical reasons, I'm not going to do it, but I think there probably are psychological reasons as well why he doesn't figure them. But in Lear, as Paul suggests, you have this remarkable configuration of the father and his three daughters, and it's, I think, clear, how shall we say, clear to us now, and I think Shakespeare makes it at least plausibly clear then that the father has been a terrible father. He has ever but slenderly known himself, says one of the older daughters to the other. He's terrifying in that demand for their love at the beginning of the play, and it explodes on him and destroys him. And then what follows from that, and here I come back to the theme of my book, but it's not alone in Lear, but overwhelmingly in Lear, is the dream that you might have a second chance, that it might come back. Shakespeare does this repeatedly in the tragedies, but Lear might be the most extreme case in which you dream that there might be a possibility of getting it back. You may know that there was a source for King Lear, that Shakespeare is almost as always never made up his own stories, but ripped off other people's stories. In the case of Lear, there is a source that was well known. There was another play about King Lear that was on stage in his time, and his company probably said to Shakespeare, look, we need a Lear play. And in the source, Cordelia lives. That's crucial. And Lear gets a second chance. That's the source that Shakespeare was using. And the original audience for King Lear would have actually, insofar as they knew the story, and it was extremely well known, as I say, it was a play that other people had performed, and it was a historical source, they would have expected Cordelia to be alive at the end. And Shakespeare stages this in an extraordinary way, Lear holding the body of his daughter and holding the feather up to her lips and saying, if this feather stirs, she lives, it will be a redemption of everything in my life. This feather stirs, he says, she lives, but she doesn't live. She's dead as earth, as he says. So he stages in the most extraordinary way the dream that you would get a second chance after you've screwed up, after you've destroyed everything, the possibility that it would come back, and then it doesn't come back. She's dead as earth. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, he says, and thou no breath at all? She's dead. And right up to the end of the play, as you may remember, Lear thinks at the very last second that she might be alive, but she's not. It's an illusion. He has no second chance.
It is extraordinary, isn't it? And at the end of the play, there lies the father with 3 daughters, all dead.
Yes.
Lear strikes me as a play which almost provocatively holds out the hope of a second chance right through Acts 4 and 5. It keeps, you think, getting better, and there's going to be that reprieve, and obviously you've just described the final reprieve. But it doesn't, and it remains a tragedy, and the tragedies all seem to deny the second chance.
I mean, they're really structured around that possibility. Here I am in my full. This is the key that unlocks it all, but we get that it's not. But it's at least a key, that the tragedies are repeatedly about this dream of a second chance that is defeated. Maybe least of all Hamlet, only because he seems to know at the beginning that there's no way out of this situation, no cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right, he says. This is some terrible thing that's been dumped on him when he's just home from university. But in virtually all of the tragedies, there's this, Lear is rather like Othello, where the crazy moment in Othello that's very hard to stage. It's a very awkward moment, in fact, in which Desdemona gets up after she's been killed, as it were, smothered. And she says, oh, she recovers, only to say, oh, well, it wasn't Othello's fault, and then dies again. As if Shakespeare were going out of his way. I think it's actually not a very successful idea on his part, if I can venture to say that, to have Desdemona come up for a moment to show that Othello's not getting a second chance. And in Macbeth, there's that extraordinary moment early in Macbeth in which he has raised the possibility of killing Duncan, and then he thinks, no, I'm not going to do it. The plan is off, he tells his wife. And then she provokes him into renewing the idea of killing Duncan. So he has a moment in which he can go back from this and live a decent, honorable life. And then he backs into this nightmare in which he will have no further second chances, in which he'll dig himself deeper and deeper into blood until he's in this nightmare of tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow at the end of the play.
I mean, that idea of the second chance sort of poised there right until the end of each tragedy, I think is even in Hamlet, because he does finally kill Claudius, and he becomes, presumably at that moment, King Hamlet, and can look forward to a great life, ruling Denmark. And then he's told that he's also been stabbed and poisoned, and so he is King Hamlet for 2 minutes, and then also passes helplessly into no chance of death, with the ironic phrase, tell my story, at least, tell my story.
And that tell my story is actually quite important. I mean, important maybe for all of us in different ways. I went to a wonderful session this morning with Avi Shlaim, whom I'm seeing here, who has told his story. The desire to tell your story, to think about what the shape of your life has been, and to communicate the shape of your life to others is a deep theme, as if it were the possibility that we might all have, even if we've not had everything that we want, the possibility to project ourselves forward. Shakespeare, again, virtually invented that phrase, tell my story. It shows up in The Tempest, it shows up in Othello, it shows up in Hamlet, as if Shakespeare discovered maybe not uniquely, but it's unusually intense in Shakespeare, that you could think of your life as a story. It's not, for example, in Montaigne, Shakespeare's great contemporary, doesn't think his life has a story. In fact, he thinks it's ridiculous to think your life has a story. Your life is too incoherent for that. Too many different pieces moving in too many different directions. It's an illusion, vulgar illusion, to think you can make up a story. But Shakespeare thinks, no, you can actually think about your life as a narrative. You can start, all of us can do that. We can start from the beginning and work our way through to wherever we are and fashion a story and tell it to people.
I'm interested in the plays in which, protagonists and others are the victims of circumstance or the victims of other people, and the plays in which somehow or other people, perhaps particularly in the comedies, can somehow manage to recreate their own lives by their own will and determination and goodness, like I say, Viola in Twelfth Night or something. I think because he picked up Othello, it's such an important play. Iago, 5 people in that play, but Othello in particular, have their lives completely changed solely at the instigations of one devious, machinating person, kind of theatre director character. Interestingly, I think, called Iago, which I always feel has the ego in it somehow, and the agon in it, as the agent of change. But, there is a play in which great people's second lives are wrecked as a result of one person's malevolence. In a way, Othello starts as a second life because we know the past of Othello and Desdemona. And now they are married, and it is extraordinary, and this is going to be the great second life. He's won the war in Cyprus.
Yes.
And then suddenly this devious character comes and destroys them both.
I want to venture to push back a little bit on both of the things you've said, which of course are true enough, and yet there's some other side of them. It's true, Iago is a monster, the most terrifying character I think that Shakespeare ever invented, and in some disturbing and demonic way, some image that Shakespeare must have had of himself as a kind of manipulator of other people, as maneuvering them around, getting them to do what he wants them to do. But it's also the case that Iago is successful at doing what he does because he sees something in Othello that he's able to manipulate. And the thing he's able to see in Othello is some very disturbing and dark sexual problem, a problem involving misogyny, fantasies about his mother, to come back to something you said earlier, remember that handkerchief which comes via his mother, fantasies about the purity of the wife. Shakespeare is interested in how should we say, we could have as a subtitle for lots of Shakespeare plays, and certainly for Othello, what's the matter with men? What is the matter with them? And that's something that Iago gets. That's the incredible power of Iago, that there's something wrong with all the men in the play. And Iago is able to do that because there's something tremendously wrong with himself, but he's able to tap into that thing and to manipulate principally Othello, but also Cassio and all the other men in the play. And I said I would push back there, and I also push back on the comedy side. Of course, it's true that Viola is wonderful, that those women are extraordinary in the comedies. It's connected to what I've just said because it's a feature of Shakespeare's comedies that the women are much better than the men. And one of the problems of Shakespeare's comedies is that if you try to think about what the marriages are going to be like after they're over, you think, oh my God, that Rosaline, the wonderful Rosaline, is going to be married to the sort of dull Orlando, that Viola is going to be married to the crazily neurotic Orsino. They're all miserable marriages at the end, but Shakespeare has the wit not to depict them. But the pushback is the sense that in most of those comedies, it's not because the women do something fabulously clever, the exception maybe being Merchant of Venice, it's that they're lucky. Shakespeare has a very strong sense that in the comedies, you have to be lucky. The comedies really are, in a sense, not about you could say that they're about getting a second chance, but they're really about holding on to your first chance. falling in love or getting your first family back. You think you've lost your family. Like my most terrifying experience as a young child, which only will suggest how innocent and lucky I was to lose my mother in a big department store and think, where is she? And then having the thrill of getting my mother back. But Shakespeare depicts that in an incredibly powerful way again and again in the early comedies of getting your family back. But it's a piece of luck in most. It's just it's an accident. It's not an accident in the late plays. It's not an accident in the tragedies where you don't get, and it's not an accident in the history plays. But the comedies, it tends to be accompanied by accident.
So it suddenly makes me think, luck and lack of luck. There are two lovers in a romance called Romeo and Juliet, who in a way that could have been a comedy if it had ended happily, if they hadn't been afflicted by the most appalling accidental bad luck.
Yes, I mean, Romeo and Juliet is a comedy that's gone sour. I mean, it's staged that way, and the devices are very much about that, and we have almost nothing, virtually nothing, that Shakespeare said about his own practice as a playwright, except what's in the plays. But there's one tiny piece of that, which may be apocryphal, but in the late 17th century, the poet John Dryden heard from somebody else who knew someone who knew Shakespeare, that Shakespeare said about Romeo and Juliet that I had to kill Mercutio before Mercutio killed the play. And that's evidence for, if it is evidence at all, evidence for the fact that Shakespeare knew that he was staging a comedy, and that the comedy was actually about to go over off the cliff as a tragedy unless you could get rid of Mercutio. And then, of course, a set of accidents, including Shakespeare's equivalent of COVID, which is the plague that turns out to keep the message from being delivered at the right time to save the life of Romeo and Juliet.
Brilliant. I want to move on to the art form we're talking about, which is theatre. Shakespeare is the world's, in English, greatest dramatist. No need to say he's the greatest poet or writer, because he was not interested in the form of literature. He was interested in only in the form of drama. And when we say, of Hamlet, tell my story, there is an irony there, because we've probably learned through that play more than any other that people's lives cannot be retroactively repacked into a story form and have the essence of the truth that happened, including the truth of accident and unluckiness, perhaps. So drama is the only art form which is actually created out of real experience. And the situation is as here. You can all read Stephen's books. You can all even listen to him on the radio or something. But the experience of engaging with the person on a stage is existentially core to what drama is. And really, a play starts with an audience like this, looking at a load of people dressed up in funny clothes probably and pretending to be other people, and you intuitively feel, what is this, And then in 2 or 3 hours later, you may, with a Shakespeare play, have had an experience which has changed your life, and it's just been enormously truthful. So, there's something Freudian, I feel there. There's something about, an audience, much more than a reader, has a contract by which they are being invited to interpret what they're seeing on play, to engage with it if they can, maybe to judge it. At the end of The Tempest, even the great dramaturg Prospero goes to the audience on his own and says, I've lost all my power, I've lost all my art. I need you to release me and send me on my way across the seas back to my dukedom. Is theatre, not just for Shakespeare, but for the concept of the second chance, the most illuminating and natural life force for creating this stuff?
It's a fascinating issue. You may have heard, and it was mentioned very, very briefly in the introduction, that Paul is writing a book about witnessing, and witnessing is, of course, one of the crucial elements of the theater. You are witnesses to the events that take place on the stage. You can't intervene in them unless you break the the fourth wall of the stage, but you're watching and you're witnessing and you're judging. I would have said that on the one hand, the theater is a version of life in which there is no. It looks like there's no second chance because it's all scripted anyway. Hamlet is going to die. That play has been written. Cordelia is not going to come back because Shakespeare wrote it that way. So on the one hand, it looks like life, accidental, crazy, spontaneous, unpredictable, and yet it's been scripted. And you could say that's a certain version of the world. How should we say, the world according to John Calvin, or the world according to someone who believes that everything has been determined. But the actual experience, living experience of the theater is not like that, either performing or watching. Because if you've ever done what I certainly have done, and I'm sure most of you have done, to see a play a second time, even the same actors, the same performance, it's quite different. It's different because the audience is different. It's different because the actors are different. The whole mood comes out. Lines that you think that everyone roared with laughter about the first time go flat the second time, or vice versa. I mean, the whole feeling is different. And I think Shakespeare thought about his own medium as a medium that could be transformed quite dramatically. It is the case that Shakespeare routinely wrote much more than could be performed in the afternoon. It gets dark in England, especially in the late fall and winter months. You couldn't possibly perform everything that was written in a play like Hamlet. You have to cut it. And we know that these plays were seriously cut and refashioned. And I think Shakespeare understood, as a part of his business model, that the plays were going to be constantly reimagined, rethought, given second chances. And that's why they're alive today. If they were forms that could only be performed in the way that they were first conceived by Shakespeare, I think they'd be dead now. But they're not dead now because they're constantly refigured and reimagined.
And do you think, Stephen, that might be why he wasn't particularly enthusiastic about publishing his own plays or writing things which would be fixed for it? I mean, let's face it, many of the plays we only have because two friends of his 7 years after his death said, we've got to get this stuff together and create the folio. So 7 years after his death, we see The Tempest for the first time or whatever. And Shakespeare was not interested, unlike Ben Jonson, in these are my complete works.
Yes.
He understood the transience of it all.
Half the plays appeared in the inexpensive format during his lifetime, and half the plays would be lost, as Paul says, if it hadn't been for the folio that his friends produced. I think there is something to that Shakespeare wasn't particularly, people were interested in reading his plays, that's clear. Half the plays wouldn't have been published if it weren't a good commercial venture in his time. And likewise, that folio, which was incredibly expensive, it cost £1, which is a lot, in 1623, indicated that people wanted to read them. But Shakespeare was not principally interested, I think it's fair to say, in having them read. He wanted to have his poems read, not the sonnets, but the long Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis. Those were beautifully published. But the plays, I think there's no indication that he was interested in the publication during his lifetime of the plays. And Hamlet's a perfect instance. As some of you will know, the first version of Hamlet that was published was clearly a pirated edition. People wanted to read it. And they managed to get probably the actor who played Marcellus, to dictate what he remembered of the play to the printer. And that's why anytime Marcellus, as it were, is near the play, the text is very much what we think Shakespeare wrote. Anytime the character who played Marcellus went off to have a beer, the text goes crazy. I mean, to be or not to be, there's the point, and so forth and so on. I mean, he vaguely remembers it, but this is because people wanted to read it, but Shakespeare wasn't particularly interested in letting it go.
Steve, before we move on towards questions, I've got one other area I want to go into. But just before that, I wondered if we could specifically focus, because it brings together a lot of things you've been saying in the last 10 minutes or so, on one scene in one play. And this is The Winter's Tale and the coming to life of Hermione. And I say this because your half of this great book sort of finishes with this scene. And then Adam, in his start to the Freud half of the book, picks up on this scene and takes it through. And, and it's the scene in which you'll explain it, but Leontes thinks he's looking at a work of art, a sculpture, and then a bit like in theatre, it goes from the art form of painting into he's told to, why don't you try believing in this thing? And he believes in that sculpture, and it comes to life, and it's his dead wife come back and gives him his second chance.
Let me say that I love the Winter's Tale, and I want to talk about it. That it's not in the book, but as I originally conceived of what I was doing, I thought I would write a 12-step program to having a second chance using the Winter's Tale. That is to say, I thought I would that I would use as the form of my book the self-help book. And I did it, I didn't wind up doing it that way, but I did it because I'm interested, actually, genuinely, in the possibility of using Shakespeare as using the other great writers that we love. And perhaps this will sound too simple-minded to you, but using them in your life, trying to figure out how you could make your life better using the works that you care about, that you love. And I thought that The Winter's Tale could give me the template for the Shakespeare 12-step program for having a second chance in life. And that involves figuring out what to do when you've destroyed everything, destroyed your relationships, destroyed the deep feelings of love in your life, that when you feel in a kind of wasteland, and what it would take to get out of that feeling and to find a new possibility in life. And that involves starting by acknowledging your failure, coming to terms with your disaster. Shakespeare thinks it takes 16 years. That's a lot to come to terms with your failure in the second chance, in The Winter's Tale. But some act of coming to terms with the fact that you screwed up. One thing that's interesting about, and you alluded to it at the beginning, and I'm not going to talk about politics, thank God, but one thing that is interesting about our current, as an American, our current national spectacle of what looks like a second chance, is it doesn't involve any acknowledgement of fault, any mistake, anything that went wrong. And that, from a Shakespearean point of view, would spell disaster. But I won't judge as to whether it will spell disaster in the current circumstance.
Now, last thing, but while we're doing that, could you put up hands for questions, which we'll take immediately afterwards, and would our wonderful, I don't know what your professional name is, mic holders, be ready for that. Just picking up then on what you say, your book, this book is extraordinarily honest and personal, as well as being about Shakespeare. Actually, it's very hard to write about Shakespeare without getting honest and personal, but you actually start with the story of your own second chance. I wonder if you wanted to say that to inspire any of us about there's always hope.
Well, what I really want to say is that for those of you who are thinking of writing anything, is not that you have to write about yourself. In fact, it can be tedious to write about yourself, but you have to dig down and reach something inside you. Otherwise, it's not going to have any authenticity at all. So I decided to come clean. I'm looking out at a sign in front of me that says the Bare Bar, B-A-R-E. And so I decided to bare myself at the beginning of Second Chances and explain that I was writing to some extent, a very strong extent, out of personal experience. My life, it's mostly of interest to myself, but my life was divided in two. The first half in Berkeley, California, writing largely for an academic audience, and people called me Steve, which was perfectly acceptable to me. And the second half of my life was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. People mysteriously started calling me Stephen rather than Steve. I started writing in a different way, and most importantly, and more centrally, I had a different wife, different love in my life, a different partner, a different conception of what my life was about, and that transformed me. And I thought that I had to come to terms with the fact that I have had two lives, not radically separated. They're not radically separated in Shakespeare's version, but there's some very powerful way in which they're different, and in which they're different over a disaster, a failure, a collapse. And the question is, what lies on the other side of the collapse?
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephen. Now, questions. And no life stories, please. Pithy, to the point questions. We've got 5 minutes, 20 seconds. You have 10 seconds to ask your question. I'm hopeless at this, so somebody's got a mic. Please, go ahead.
Hi, good morning or afternoon. Has there been a time when you have gone into a Shakespeare play with a very strict opinion about a character or about a play, watched the production and changed your mind?
I have had that experience. That's a very interesting question. I've had that experience, yes, multiple times, sometimes happily and sometimes unhappily. The unhappy version of it was a version of King Lear that I just saw in New York. Why am I forgetting the name of sorry? Kenneth Branagh, yes, thank you. With Kenneth Branagh being an extraordinarily young and buff King Lear. He looked like he'd been in the gym very recently, and he was maybe 45 years old and very big and tough. And I never imagined King Lear that way, and I thought it was a disaster. On the other hand, I have seen productions that have completely transformed my idea of what the actual experience of the play might be and what the character is like. So just to stay with Lear, I saw a production with Murray Abraham years ago in which he was not a senile or decayed old man, but a deeply disturbed, internally disturbed old man. And I thought that was actually powerful, and we could talk about other productions. Yes, they're actors. Shakespeare was extraordinarily generous to actors. He was himself an actor, though apparently not a very good one. But he hung out all his life with actors, and he gave them a lot. Ben Jonson clearly didn't like actors, he makes it clear he didn't like them. But Shakespeare gives a huge gift to actors. And that gift is you can do it in lots of different ways. And you can surprise people. And it can show up in ways you will never expect. And that also allows things like gender transformations, race-blind casting, all kinds of things you wouldn't expect that can work in Shakespeare that can't work so easily in other early playwrights.
Okay, I can't do any DIE or EDI on choice of questioners, so please just give it to whoever's nearest to you, please.
Good afternoon to you. I just wanted to know, how would you interpret Kurosawa's interpretation of King Lear as a second chance?
Whose interpretation?
Kurosawa.
Akira Kurosawa.
Are you thinking of Ran?
I think he is.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ran is one of the great movies. I mean, I was thinking of Ran actually in relation to all of those the power of transformation that Shakespeare invites and makes possible. In some ways, Ran is very, very far away, as you know, from what Shakespeare wrote. It's about fathers and sons, not about fathers and daughters. It has a very different conception of how the politics play out. And yet it feels in touch in an extraordinary way with something deep, deep, deep in Shakespeare. And I feel the same way about Kurosawa's version of Hamlet, which is, again, massively transformed. The bad sleep well in a multinational corporation, 20th century corporation, very far away from the Hamlet that we think of from Shakespeare, and yet deeply, deeply in touch with what I think is profoundly in Shakespeare. And I think successful embraces of Shakespeare in the 20th and 21st century depend upon risk-taking, upon giving it a second chance by moving it away from what looks like its initial impetus. I feel the same way about, I mentioned yesterday, Vishal Bhardwaj's, several of his wonderful versions of Shakespeare plays, especially maybe about Hyder, in I think its very deep relationship to Kashmir in relation to Hamlet.
Thank you. I'm organized enough to suggest my friend at the back, you hand the microphone to somebody back there. If there's anybody asking. No, there's nobody asking. Oh, yes, there is. There's a lady there I can see reaching out. Thank you, ma'am.
So I think
Oh,
your
that's
session
not
was
her.
called Second Chances, Shakespeare and Freud. So you did not really talk about Freud. So I would really like to know about Second Chances by Freud's theories.
All right, thank you. I'm not going to be adequate to Adam Phillips's wonderful account of Freud, except to start by saying that Freud centrally concerned himself in Adam Phillips's account, and my colleague Adam Phillips is the editor of the Penguin Freud and a major Freud expert. Freud concerned himself all his life in how people block the possibility of a second chance, why people refuse what looks like the possibility of a second chance. Freud thought, in Phillips's account, at the beginning of his career, that he was going to offer people the possibility of a second chance. And what he found was routinely that his patients refused that possibility. And he became fascinated with that refusal. And in Adam Phillips's account, that's the center that Freud was struggling with in developing psychoanalysis.
Thank you, Stephen. The petty pace has crept in. I'm looking at 0000 here. So the only other second chance to hear more from Stephen is to go and buy one of his books over there. So please do that. But please do come to Shakespeare's Sisters in 2 hours' time, which I think is in another venue. 1 hour's time.
Ladies and gentlemen, please
Thank
give
you.
a
Thank
huge
you,
round of
Stephen.
applause to Stephen Greenblatt and Paul Smith for such a brilliant session.